Why is ancient Greek so hard to learn? This is something I've been asking myself for years. It looks a lot like Latin. Its grammar is in some ways easier than Latin. Why should it be so much harder than learning Latin? I've learned modern languages more difficult even than ancient Greek, and yet ancient Greek has been harder to learn. As a student and a teacher for years of ancient Greek, I have been struggling with this question, but I think I finally have a cogent answer. So in this video, I want to shed some light on these problems and what we might do to actually solve them. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. So this is something that literally keeps me up at night, or at least wakes me early in the morning. And I lampooned it a couple of years ago in my Gotcha Greek video. There is one regular verb, luo, the most useless and inconsequential of all verbs. And a lot of what I had to say there is still quite relevant, I think. So first I'm going to talk about all the problems we encounter as students of the ancient Greek language, and then I'm going to talk about solutions that you can apply today. Now the first most obvious thing about ancient Greek is, well, the alphabet, right? It has all these funny letters that don't look quite like ours. Now, while that might be a problem for a few days, maybe even a week or so, if you're looking at those letters every day because of their similarity to the Roman alphabet, they're not that much of a problem. There are far more difficult and even sophisticated writing systems. Say the Cyrillic alphabet, Ukrainian and Russian. Or what about the Japanese writing system? The writing system of a language is usually a superable problem. And when it comes to the basic letters of ancient Greek, that's definitely the case. However, it is a very sophisticated orthography. The writing system of ancient Greek, which differently from Latin, it actually shows you exactly how it's supposed to be intoned, the intonation, the cadence. The prosody of the language is written into it with those accent marks. That's why it's so important to learn the accent system, because it's so fundamental to the grammar of the language. So in a way, it makes it easier than Latin, which doesn't have that advantage. We have these beautiful pronunciation guides that are part of the spelling system of every word. But it's also challenging because you actually have to learn it. A lot of people just ignore the accents or the long vowels or any number of other things. And by doing so, they permanently miss out on some of the most beautiful and important parts of the literature, to say nothing of understanding its grammar and morphology. So you have to know the long vowels, you have to know the pitch accent. I'll be making more videos about that in the future to help you learn that, such as in the case of classical Attic. Don't worry, those videos are coming. So we'll put the pronunciation issue to the side and concentrate on other visual aspects of the language. Now, one of those diacritical marks that's not particularly useful for us is the smooth breathing. For a while, I tried writing ancient Greek without the smooth breathing, and I found I just didn't like it because the word didn't really look normal if it started with a vowel, and it didn't have that smooth breathing on it, instead of starting with the rough breathing, which is, of course, the sound huh, the H sound of English. Now, the rough breathing, that's important, but when you get these tiny little texts, wait a minute, where's my substitute? Wait, let me get Xenophon. Here we go. So here's Xenophon. So in this tiny little text, you got there's hail, tool, but there's way. So you have to be able to recognize that this word does not start with an H sound. Looks identical to this word starts with an H sound, turned backward, just like a bird.
Turned backward, just like a bird.
This is just like the velociraptor pubic bone turned backwards, that it means one thing and the other. Now when it's zoomed like this, it's not too bad, but look how tiny this is. Why is it so tiny? Why are the letters smaller on the Greek side than they are on the Italian side, I ask you? So the way that ancient Greek text is printed is definitely a problem because if it's small, if it's not easy to distinguish something as critical as a rough breathing versus a smooth breathing, then, well, that's a problem with the printer. The more you read ancient Greek, when you become a fluent reader, it's not that bad because you know pretty much every word you're already reading. That's the idea, right? You know every word you're reading except for maybe one or two on a page at most, even as an advanced learner. So maybe we could do without the smooth breathing. Obviously, it's not there in the modern Greek alphabet, but they don't pronounce the rough breathing, so they don't need either one. But what is really interesting is that when it's not there, you do kind of miss it because we get used to the shape of a word. And this is a more difficult part of ancient Greek, that there are a lot of words with prefixes that come from prepositions like epi and pro and apo and all these things. And that's not so bad. You get used to those. You see those prepositions applied to words like, say, peogein, to flee, apopeogein. Not so bad. But then you see apepugon. In fact, wait, let's just go back to peogein. That's a decent example. If I want to say I fled, it is epugon. So now the shape of the word is quite different. Now it's starting with the letter E. It's starting with E, the epsilon. Why is that an issue? It's an issue because, in general, when reading a language, our brains are attuned to seeing word shapes. And this is especially true for native speakers who read their own languages in which there isn't a lot of inflection, like English. We put as plurals and things on the ends of words. We have some S's that we have, but we don't do that much to the ends of words. In the beginning, we hardly change those ever. But in Greek, you certainly change the end, much as we often do in Latin. But in Latin, when you want to go to the past tense, you don't add a prosthetic vowel, an augment to the beginning of it. But you have to do that in ancient Greek. You have to say epugon. And then, of course, the ending is different. And this on, is this a neuter ending of a noun, the masculine or accusative? So with the little bits of the morphology, which of course are similar, just as in any language, we can't expect one ending to have just one meaning. The S in English is used for the third person singular, he records, and also the noun, the records. So peugo to epugon, okay, the ending we have to get used to, but it's the beginning, the E. You have to see it, of course, because this is marking the past tense, very useful for that. But then you have to see past it, see the beginning of that morpheme boundary, and see where, oh, that's where the root is. That's where the beginning of the word is, and that's where the meaning is, in the pug, in the p, and the g. Because you also might have noticed there's a change in the stem there. The vowels have changed from eu to u. Thankfully, this is a pretty regular stem change in ancient Greek, but you have to get used to it. And we're going to get to the solutions for that soon enough. So then, say you're used to the present like apupeugo, I run away. Run away! Run away! Run away! And then you run across the word apepugon. Greek is all about euphony. It has to sound good. Not too difficult to teach or even to learn. The problem is when we're trying to read fluently as beginners or even intermediate readers, we have to be very comfortable with those kinds of changes. Those changes are frequent, they're fundamentally predictable, but only if you're familiar with the system. And then totally fundamental regular verbs like say, pileo, I love. Well, that's just the dictionary form, that pileo. If you're not dealing with some kind of ionic or Hadavas or something, you're not going to see that. You're going to instead see pilo, I love. And then it's going to be piles, for you love, and pile. Okay, that's not so bad. So is it pile men for we? No, it's pilou men. Why is it pilou men? In ancient Greek, especially in Attic and Koine, we see these vowel combinations. For example, when you have an epsilon plus an omicron e plus u, then that becomes u. Why is that happening? Because the E and the O are on the same horizontal line in the International Phonetic Alphabet vowel chart to help you visualize it, and thus the epsilon is attracted into the roundedness and the backness of the O. Thus, instead of E-O, it's O-O. Well, O-O is just O, and O is spelled as you see here on the right. In later Greek, it's pronounced simply U. Thus, we have the sequence of the root pile plus the ending omen, pileomen, pilomen, pilomen. Pronounced later in Hellenistic Koine as simply pilumen. Again, this one example isn't that hard to wrap our brains around, but it's the cumulative effect of hundreds of these things happening on the page that we have to keep track of or be so good as readers that we don't even notice. And if you're learning especially just to read this language without a whole lot of input from fluent ancient Greek speakers around you, while a small and learnable detail, this keeps getting repeated throughout the system. So you have to get used to seeing so many of these examples before you're finally used to them. Then when you see final ooh, it can befuddle you. If it's an imperative or just an indicative singular, if it's a middle voice verb. And speaking of the middle voice, how the grammar of ancient Greek is actually taught in the textbooks, whether they're some of the better readers or the traditional, just really painful grammar translation textbooks, as good as they might be in summarizing grammatical points. They teach these concepts in ways that are just not at all tangible. Here, let me break it down for you. If you know a Romance language, the middle voice is just like the reflexive or reciprocal, say in Italian, mi lavo le mani. That means I wash my hands. Literally, it means me to me, lavo, I wash, le mani, the hands. To me, I wash the hands. A lot of languages do that, even German, actually. In ancient Greek, it's luomai tas keras. Or in fact, tolkere in the dual, though we'll leave that aside for now. That can be really helpful. It's not that difficult of a concept to learn. But the middle is used all the time in ancient Greek in so many different ways. If you're not using the language actively, if you don't hear commands, hopefully in a friendly way, being shouted at you, it's really hard to get used to all of these little grammatical complexities. but they can be learned even if we're reading, even if we're on our own, even if we're doing minimal speaking, just reciting aloud, trying to talk to ourselves a little. The more of that you do, the better, of course. But we're not at the solutions yet. We're still kvetching about the problems. Another problem that's axiologon, worthy of mention, is that the literature is pretty heterogeneous. Beautifully. That's what makes learning ancient Greek so valuable. You get the beginning of Western literature in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And you have literature that goes all the way up, not just to the end of antiquity, but still authors in medieval Greek are writing in essentially the same language, much like medieval Latin. All of the amazing and important benefits to learning Latin are there in the Greek language too. Well, if people learn Latin, most people want to read Caesar, or Virgil, Cicero. Maybe they want to read one of the poets like Ovid or Catullus. If they're really wonderful people, they want to read Apuleius. But in all that, it's essentially just the same language in style and form. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of differences between, say, Cicero and Apuleius. But compared to the differences you find between the later Koine literature and Homer, for example, or let's just take classical Attic. There's a great deal more divergence. Ancient Greek was ancient when the Romans were starting to write their first books. So the vast majority of students of Latin end up concentrating on that classical Latin of Virgil and Cicero and Caesar, and that's, of course, wonderful. But the people who want to learn ancient Greek, some people just want to read biblical Koine, Kini for you modern Greek speakers. Or they want to read Homer, or they want to read classical Attic. And those three groups get encountered with very different types of literature. And that means that textbooks often try to cater to all three, which is good. And sometimes they also make the mistake of concentrating too much on just one of these. I think it's important if you're an aspiring Atticist, classicist, to also be exposed to biblical Koine. That's also, especially because it's easier to read. But you also should get exposed to a bit of Homer, have a teacher ideally show you a little bit of it, prepare you for what is to come when you actually do open up the Iliad. But the problem that we're going to get to is you have to get good at recognizing all the patterns. So when it comes to the heterogeneity of the ancient Greek literature, the problem with all the books that we have to learn the language is they don't give you nearly enough of any one of them. Even if they do concentrate on just Attic or just Homeric or just biblical, you're not going to get nearly enough input and you're not going to see enough of the forms. Being exposed to different dialects or literary registers for a beginner is not so much of a good idea. And all these little things summed up end up making not I'd think the main problem with trying to learn ancient Greek, but a good part of it. Any one of them, you can get by. You can get through the writing system, the pronunciation, a good classical Attic pronunciation, or an ancient pronunciation, like say, Lucian pronunciation, one of those variants. Any one of those is definitely learnable. The morphology, the grammar, don't even me started on the participles and infinitives, though they are very powerful and very useful. All of that is learnable. The fact that the stuff that you might actually want to read, say, I want to read all of it, but if your concentration is more on one or the other, I can appreciate the frustrations that can occur. I've experienced them myself. These textbooks can really be one of the problems. Even the readers, even the good ones, there really aren't any good ones, they're all just mediocre, like the ones I talked about in the Ranieri-Roberts approach. Virtually all of them are shockingly cowardly. And what do I mean by that? This goes for the standard grammar translation textbooks as well. They're terrified of teaching you the me verbs, or ones like, say, dynamai. You get this impression after weeks or months or even years that, oh, those are irregular. They're not. They're totally regular, and they're totally learnable, and they're totally not hard at all. But for some reason, the textbooks want to avoid showing them to you, I guess because you don't have them in Latin. I guess that's the reason. They want to shelter you from the middle voice because the Latin doesn't have that, except, oh yeah, it kind of does, at least with deponent verbs. Locor, dialegomai, same thing, not that difficult. For all the good that they can bear, these textbooks and readers are so pedagogically flawed as to be utterly shocking. How could these teachers have actually thought some of these choices were good ideas? The Ranieri-Roberts Approach video goes into more detail about all of that. But that's not really the main problem. Latin's a difficult language, right? For what reason? Well, often how it's taught. If it's taught poorly, well, it's not going to be any fun. Well, what is poor teaching? Grammar translation methods tend to be pretty poor. Why? Because if you get random sentences that are just teaching grammatical forms, then they will be painfully boring. When you learn something, you have to have some kind of a dopamine hit for the effort. Otherwise, it won't stick. and it'll be very difficult to keep going. And if you're trying to learn Latin or Ancient Greek, you probably want to actually read, right? You want to experience the literature. You want to access what these ancient people, or even modern people, depending on the author, are trying to tell us. It's amazing. It's fantastic. And what are they trying to tell us? Often, they're stories. So when you have a bare-bones grammar translation textbook with random sentences about the strategos and xantippe without connection to a narrative, it just won't stick, which is another thing. You need a narrative, which is why the readers can be quite helpful, assuming that their stories are good, and most of the cases they're not, at least for Ancient Greek. This is the main benefit for why Familia Romana is such a good book, because the story is reasonably charming. Yeah, it shelters the grammar in a way that allows you to really understand everything as you go, but you don't actually have to understand everything in order to acquire a language. French in Action is such a great example of this. Just by listening and observing the characters, if you watch that all the way through the first time without knowing any French, you're going to learn a lot of French. But if you rewatch the same episode multiple times, or the whole series a couple of times, you're going to get so much more the second time. It's cumulative. It builds. Why French in Action works, why Familia Romana works, is because they have great stories. Or should I say, charming stories. If you resonate with the story and the characters, you're going to want to keep reading. And if you don't happen to resonate with these stories, well, then all the pedagogical benefits in the method are probably not going to be that effective. So for an autodidact, you're on your own, how do you learn these languages? It can be so challenging. A plain old stale grammar textbook, to some people, it can appeal, but it wears thin after a while, especially when you know there's a better way. When I learned German in high school, one of the things that made it so great is I had just the best teachers. They were enthusiastic, they told us stories, they gave us context. So even if you were learning, doing this grammar thing or learning how to use this or whatever in conversation, the whole experience of the weeks and months of years of learning that language, wow, I remember that fondly, and I love German today for that reason. The teacher can set the tone by guiding the students through such a wonderful experience, and that's what we do at the Ancient Language Institute. We take the best resources that exist and improve them tenfold with extensive visual and audio material. Here's our new Ancient Greek course. Aigunaigues gelausin.
Otes talates teos. Tis lege tobau. Okuon lege tobau.
You have clear visuals, you get to hear it, and then you slowly get used to the written word. In class, we engage you as much as we can in the target language. I get my Ancient Greek students speaking on the very first day, and they love it because they realize, hey, I can do this too. So many of the things I was talking about today are discouraging about learning Ancient Greek. But at Ancient Language Institute, we're all about encouraging, empowering our students, both in the classroom and at home. You can learn Latin, you can learn Ancient Greek, you can learn Old English and Biblical Hebrew. And we also have a wide variety of intermediate and advanced courses, as well as private tutoring too. If you sign up by December 14th, you'll become one of our students in the spring semester. Wouldn't it be amazing to read Beowulf or the Hebrew Bible? What about the Iliad, the Aeneid? These things are within your reach. So sign up today at ancientlanguage.com. Now, the biggest problem with learning Ancient Greek, with respect to learning Latin, is that Latin is just way easier. I know that sounds kind of silly. Didn't we just cover that? No, I mean like, really. When we learn Latin as English speakers, we are enormously advantaged. In Western Europe and in the Americas, most people end up learning at least one other European language, especially a Romance language. English speakers, the vast majority of us learn Spanish, or we learn French. Some of us might even learn German. German can help you because you learn about the case system. That's a weird thing that German has, and it's frankly way easier in Latin because it's easier to see. But the real advantage does come from learning something like French or Spanish or Italian or Portuguese or Romanian, because these Romance languages are filled with words that are derived from Latin. So if you get to an intermediate, just like a B1 level in, say, Spanish or Italian or French, you're going to be able to get to a similar level in Latin much faster because so many of the words are cognates. So much of the more advanced or technical or artistic or literary vocabulary that we have in the Romance languages is the same in Latin, or real similar, or the roots are right there. So it's easy to read, it's easy to understand. Also, therefore, it can be easy to speak. And even if you don't know any Romance language at all, English is filled with the same words. And this is not an idle observation. Take the word observation. What's that in a Romance language? Like French, observation, osservazione in Italian, observatio in Latin. Isn't that easy? They're all there. Even if there might be better ways idiomatically, you at least will recognize the root if you're reading it, and you will definitely be able to say something. But how would you say that in Greek? Do we have a word that goes with that? In this case, we do. It's theoria. But we use that for theory. And we don't necessarily think of theory as observation because we use it differently. And that's at least a word we do have in English, but so many more we don't. So my hypothesis, something that I'll just put under, is that the real fundamental challenge is the fact that we have free lunches all the time in Latin. Even the most challenging texts are replete with our vocabulary as English speakers. Even German speakers have a lot of these words in their technical and advanced and literary vocabulary. And as Romance speakers, forget about it. You got everything you need in Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese at least, and certainly Romanian too, to get pretty far. Then it's just a matter of getting used to the syntax and of course the grammar too, in order to become a fluent reader of Latin. But despite having some Greek vocabulary, it's just not nearly enough as English speakers, as Italian speakers, in order to make the same kind of relatively rapid progress that we can make in Latin. The vast majority of people that want to learn ancient Greek, or students who are trying to do it, are speakers of Western European languages natively. And if they studied another language, it was probably another Western European language. Owing so much of their literature and even of their basic vocabulary to Latin, speakers of English and Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian and German and many others are tremendously advantaged. And yeah, a lot of us do learn Spanish or Italian or French. Does that mean it's a good idea to learn modern Greek? Well, I talked about this with Rafael Turrigiano and Davide Gemello a few years ago. And our conclusion was, if you want to learn Latin and Italian, and you're absolutely going to learn both, you might as well learn Italian first, because you get to have the experience of learning a modern language that is directly descended from the ancient language that's also your target. And there is a lot of cross-pollination there. There's a lot of help that's going to give you to really easily immerse yourself in the Latin language from elementary to advanced levels. But if you're not as interested in Italian, or if that's something that's going to come later after you want to learn Latin first, that's fine. Just learn Latin. You don't require that. Same thing for Greek. If you absolutely want to learn both modern Greek and ancient Greek, modern Greek's a lot more accessible, and it's going to give you a lot more basic vocabulary that you're going to easily transfer over. But there are some significant caveats. A lot of the words in modern Greek are spelled identically or really similarly to the ancient Greek words, whereas you see more spelling changes over in the Romance languages. And it can give you the impression that a lot of these words have the same meaning. In fact, a lot of modern Greeks have this idea too. When they see their words in ancient Greek texts, they interpret them with the same meaning, but very frequently these meanings have shifted, a lot more even than over in the Romance languages, or even some of those Latin words that were borrowed into English. So it's going to help to a certain extent to expose you to certainly the Greek alphabet and to more roots, but it's also going to potentially disadvantage you at the same time. So if you want to learn both, absolutely, but go whole hog, learn all of modern Greek really well, not just at the basic level. In order to get those vocabulary words that you really need to make the kind of rapid progress that's so easy for an English speaker learning Latin, you're going to have to get up to at least C1 in modern Greek in order to be exposed to enough literature and technical terms and so many other things that will empower you to make faster progress in ancient Greek. But like I said, if modern Greek isn't your focus, if Italian's not your focus, if Spanish is not your focus, don't learn those first before you go to the ancient language. Spend your time on the ancient language. So of all the problems we've talked about so far, the biggest, I believe, is this. This is what makes ancient Greek so hard to learn. Now, if you had people with no familiarity with any Western European language at all, hard to find these days since most people at least learn English, and you expose them to both Latin and ancient Greek, they'll probably find them similarly difficult to acquire, assuming they have similarly good textbooks and materials and teachers. It certainly doesn't help that the number of competent, fluent readers and speakers of ancient Greek is so much less, maybe 1/10 or less than that of the Latin community. Thus, there are fewer people to share the amazing literature with. There are fewer people to speak with. There are fewer people to help guide and give advice. When I was learning Latin and becoming fluent, I had so many resources and people, so many opportunities to practice. I sought them out and I could find them, and they are much rarer in ancient Greek. We have to create those opportunities together in this century. But of all the challenges, of all the problems, which are cumulative, the biggest of all is just being able to recognize these vocabulary words for which we have few or no cognates in the Western European languages. So how do we solve these problems, especially that big one? And that really big problem is we don't have as many Greek words in our Western European languages that are these free lunches that we're able to just snatch up and eat every time we open up a Latin book. I was able to read, these are my supplements and all the other books in the Famiglia Romana, or rather the Lingua Latina per se illustrata series, after just 3 months of getting through Famiglia Romana super fast, but it could have taken me 2 years. The point is just getting through that, I suddenly was able to read this, Amputrio. Now, new vocabulary and other things are beautifully glossed, which is great, or rather, explained in Latin, but I just read this on the plane. I laughed my butt off. It was fantastic. On the plane going back to Italy after trying to learn Latin in 3 months. I succeeded. It was a great time. But the same year, I also got this, the story of Catiline, written by Sallust and Cicero. And even though it was definitely more challenging prose than I had seen, I still was able to read it. It doesn't hurt at all that, new vocabulary or other things that are maybe potentially unusual are explained beautifully in the margins. That definitely helps. That gives you confidence. But those things I could have probably solved or really just pushed through it. And I would have been able to read it without all of those aids. After just, the basic studying of the language. I was just looking now in the third oration against Catiline, which I've never read. And it's fantastic because I can turn to any page, any paragraph, and I can just read and totally understand. This is just totally normal Latin, which is great because of the consistency of Latin style. But more than that, it is so hard to find words that might be new to me that I don't already know from English. And indeed, I know every single word here. There's nothing unfamiliar. Et inquirites, sea quae erant ad me del lata reperto non essent, tamen ego non arbitrabar in tantis republicae periculis esse mihi nimiam diligentiam pertimescendam. It's great. I've never read that sentence before. I know exactly what it's saying. I'm with you, Cicero. I'm in the Senate House. That freaking Catiline, nuts to him. And I got this at the thrift store in Rome a little while ago. De Arte Gymnastica by Mercurialis. I didn't even know this existed. I did. One of my friends knew this book, read it in English. He's a fantastic reader. And look at this. It's beautiful. The print is from the 60s. Got this for just a couple euros. But look at that. Isn't that amazing? It even has some Greek in it too, which is interesting because this author ended up finding what all the ancients had to say about the art of gymnastics. So cool stuff. And when I can go to any single page and read ad haec habuit cuius multas species ad locorum varietate desumptas quoniam si quando extra gymnasia cursitabat prot necessitas commoditasque postulabant aut per plano loca aut per aspera aut per quali. I know exactly what he's talking about. It's very clear, and that's amazing. And it has just as much to do with the fact that almost all of those vocabulary words I also have in English, as well as the fact that I've seen them in the wild in real Latin for many years and used a number of them too. But what do you do about Xenophon or about Plato? I talked about these editions over on a polýMATHY Plus video. I reviewed a couple of them that I've been reading. These are fantastic because they calc the things for you so you don't have to, look through a dictionary, but you can still read Plato's Republic Book 1. However, this is so much harder because I've noticed this too. When I have been reading, this is until recently, and I'll tell you why when I get there as part of the solution. Just reading this, I'm just going slowly. Bancalo sen lego lege so gepale. It's very interesting. I noticed this is relatively recently. I'm reading so slowly. Why is that? Can't be the alphabet. I know every one of these letters backwards and forwards, and it really has so much to do with the cognates. So what do? How do you get the vocabulary, the ancient Greek vocabulary? Because like I said, as far as I can tell, you need to get to at least C1 no katharevousa if you're dealing with modern Greek to have the same kind of advantage as you have as just an English speaker, or say an Italian speaker, French speaker, etc. If you have at least one of those languages, fluently or otherwise, you're going to be able to get into Latin stuff. You're going to be constantly getting free lunches all along the way and never realizing what a great time you're having of it until you get to this. And even though you know all these words because you've studied ancient Greek for a while, the comprehension is still so much slower. So what's the solution? And I don't think you're going to like it. I think that's why I'm taking so long to tell you. Because it's the dumbest and most obvious solution. It's just to read. Read as much as you possibly can. Now, there's a problem with that though, especially if you've been in the Latin world, which is that you've been spoiled. I was spoiled. Everyone has been spoiled because we have everything. We have at least a fantastic series in Lingua Latina per se illustrata. That will take you to high literature, like we just saw. It'll take you to Virgil, it'll take you to Ovid, and it's got everything. Certainly more than enough to prepare you for real literature. I stopped reading a bunch of those supplements. Like I never happened to read the third oration of Catiline by Cicero because I've been having fun with Apuleius, I've been Plautus, I've been reading medieval literature, I've been reading all these other things that are actually harder in some ways than the Cicero because I wanted to read those more, and I haven't gotten around to reading the third oration of Cicero and Catiline. Even though this edition makes it so beautifully easy to read. Since I'm a fluent reader and speaker of Latin, I can just interact with the language any way I want, anytime. It's fantastic. And then, like I said, speaking, there's so many people to speak with. There's so many ways to interact in very active ways in Latin, and they're so much more limited with ancient Greek by comparison. And with not just these readers, but a whole bunch of others. I have this beautiful one here, one of Carla Hurt's fantastic projects, where she's taken the Lover's Curse, it's part of the Aeneid book 4, and she's done the easy version and then more difficult and then harder until you're basically reading the original poem by the end. What a great idea. That way you're rereading this epic work and you're just progressing right through it. We have so many wonderful tools out there for Latin. There's so many books out there that one could incorporate together. I just haven't gone beyond the Lingua Latina per se illustrata because Latin just seems like a solved problem to me. Whereas I did all that work. I was right here with you in my office talking to you about the Ranieri-Roberts approach to learning ancient Greek because it is the best thing that I was able to cobble together for myself. In fact, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. I recently finished going through all of those books. I was already reading original literature for a long time, so I wasn't necessarily going to finish all of those readers. They're all back here, reading Greek, and Ancient Greek Alive I finished a long time ago. I hadn't finished the last chapters of Rouse, and I wanted to though. I wanted to get through them and actually follow. I started at some point because I've read Athena's plenty of times. Well, at least a few times, the second volume. But I wanted to go through all of those columns and see if it actually worked for me. And doing that, since I put out that video, it has a profound effect. It is fantastic because the problem that we have is it's so hard to get extensive reading. For example, take, Athena's. This is one of the most popular books and also one of the most flawed, both pedagogically and in its narrative. However, it's something. Hey, look at that. Hey, Melita Talmajde. That's great. The advice we always give as teachers, and it's excellent advice, is reread. Reread the same thing you read a bunch of times. Being a very good reader, especially of a potentially difficult language like ancient Greek, it doesn't come naturally. I don't think, at least not in this day and age, at least not with most people. I'm not a natural reader. You probably heard me talk about this in the past. I gained a love of reading after I was fluent in Latin. Then I realized, holy cow, this language gives me access to some of the best literature that there is. I'm going to read everything I can. I hadn't seen Cicero's Third Oration till today. It's my bad. But still, there's so much to read in Latin. I was able to skip Cicero's Third Oration in Catiline, against Catiline, in Catilina, and still be perfectly content. So the good advice is you get one of these chapters, you've seen all the vocabulary, learn all these things, so the pictures on the side. If you're an Italian speaker, well, then that's great. If not, well, you have no help at all. You might want to get the English language version, second edition's best, to also see that as well. I talked about that in the Ranieri-Roberts Approach video. So you got to reread, but what if you have to reread chapter 4? Ooh, well, that might be a problem, because there's stuff in here that's just hard to follow. It becomes, and look, oh, suddenly chapter 4, your 4th chapter. This is your 4th chapter, ever reading Ancient Greek. Wall of text. If you're not an Italian speaker, you don't even get the calcs or any help at the bottom. You have to just try your best and struggle through, and wait, why? How many times did she go to the fountain? How many times did she break the Hydrian? I don't remember, because it's not a very interesting story. Huge problem, because if it's boring, it's not going to keep your interest, and it's not going to lead to acquisition. And the things that sometimes get inserted here, they just don't make sense. So with all of this beautiful help, look at these cool illustrations. There's the Piraeus. Boy, that seems chaotic as heck, but hey, that seems interesting. Those are nice pictures. Look, beautiful. Aploion. This is great stuff. I wanted 19 years ago when I got these books to love them. And they have their uses. I really discovered their use by using that Ranieri-Roberts approach. Going from, where did I start? I started around 2022. I went through pretty quickly because I read all of them in one column and then all of them in the next column, exactly as I programmed, to see if there was any obvious flaws with it. While there are better ways potentially to organize the books, organizing them by grammar seemed to get close enough to what you really need. To do extensive reading, you ideally have almost all the same grammar and all the same vocabulary. Organizing by grammar was something I could do by just looking at the chapters in the table of contents. Organizing by vocabulary would be ideal, but the vocabulary is all over the place. The vocabulary is all over the place in this. Anyway, I started kind of towards the beginning of this book in the spreadsheet of Volume 2 of Athenaeus, and went through and did all of them. I want to do the supplements. I want to do this Kibeto Spinax because it's really cool. I want to do all of them right in order and see how it went. And after having finished it, I found that where these other books I had added in, basically using Athenaeus as the spine, like reading Greek and like Rouse, it worked really well. It seemed to be pretty darn fantastic. Always new vocabulary, one relative to the other, I mean, but I was so often seeing words I had just seen in the previous chapter. So I was getting something pretty close to extensive reading, and I think it would have been that way even if I didn't have years of experience of reading actual ancient Greek literature having nothing to do with these supplements and these readers. And I was learning things. I was reinforcing things. It was also useful because, remember how I mentioned that dopamine hit? When you only have to read a short story, a section, a paragraph, when you only have to read part of a chapter, or maybe a chapter or two of one book and then you move to the next, assuming that kind of variety works for you and it doesn't send you into too much chaos, it gives you a sense of satisfaction. Okay, I completed that. What's next on the list? Okay, I'll do that. And then that's kind of cool. That gives, you need those little things. It's like, go to the gym and work out. I guess we'll throw some weights around, right? What if I give you a 3-month training program to take you from, let's say, a very elementary fitness level, or none at all, into a level of getting through basic weightlifting and athletics? Then you have a program. You know what you're supposed to do every day. And even if you miss a few days, you'll just get back on the program and stick with it. That is the idea, being consistent, having a reading plan. I'm going to have to really expand on this, and I'm coming up with a lot of this as I'm talking to you now. So let's see what cosa esce fuori. What comes out of it? Is that English? I'm going to roll up my sleeves here. There you go. Is that called the Italian roll? Vediamo cosa esce fuori da queste maniche lunghe. Niente, eh? Non sto a ingannare. Okay, so the incredibly powerful thing in that Ranieri-Roberts approach, which I did not expect, is how much better it made me as a reader of ancient Greek. See, I was already reading, like I said, authentic stuff for years, but I was learning new vocabulary because some of these books, like Reading Greek, are so great at sampling stuff, like orations by Apollodorus against Neaera. I wouldn't have sought that out, but it was super interesting in the context of the Athenian democracy in classical Greece. Great stuff, great selection. I wouldn't have necessarily seen pieces of 4 Aristophanes plays. Again, this is Reading Greek responsible for that. But also, that happens in the end of Athenese Volume 2. I happened to also get an additional, say, called a dopamine hit by the fact that I was recognizing references in, where's Rouse? Where's my Rouse reader? That's around here somewhere. Rouse! Rouse is actually Rouse, not Rouse. Rouse! Herr Rouse! Rouse, komm raus! Okay, there he is. Rouse. And noticing different expressions, idioms, different things. Maybe not just this book, others too, from literature I'd read in the wild. I found that kind of cool too. It's nice how these authors of these readers, if they know what they're doing, are actually trying to help you get acquainted with the real idiom. Fantastic. But why it was so effective, not just the introduction to different things, was because it was generally pretty extensive. It was helpful to be able to have that kind of relaxation of, I can understand this better because I put in the effort to read, I don't know, chapter 25 of Athenese, a chapter I'd seen before, but I was understanding that better because I've been reading the stuff in that column that goes with Athenese chapter 24, and all the supplements to the Athenese, which we need to talk about in a second. And it was creating this extensive reading experience. I was enjoying it. I didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep reading them. And oh, did it take forever. That's a lot of stuff to read. And if you take the time to read the cultural stuff that's written sometimes in English or in Italian, depending on which reader it is, well, that's just more reading. And you don't have to read that stuff, but it can be helpful to get the cultural context too, which is sufficiently arcane. I think it is in the case of classical Athens. It's worth learning about that on its own in your native language if you get the chance. So you have this context to fill it all in. I feel like the ancient Roman stuff is just so much better known. Who goes a single day without thinking about the Roman Empire? Paradoxically, in the point of me kind of doing this was I wanted to read all the Athenese supplements together, as well as Athenese, the English and the Italian versions together, along with the Aphodia. Here, the thing that most startled me is how this and the Kebetos Pinax and the Apodion Volume 2, which are designed to go with the chapters in Athenese, were by far, in the spreadsheet, the hardest thing to do, even though I just read the corresponding main chapter in the Athenese book. How is that possible? I haven't really figured out how. I just think because you're just so dependent on so many new vocabulary words. Yeah, this is at your level, but maybe the problem that is yet more overemphasized here is that, yeah, you're at the level grammatically, but the vocab is where the language's primary difficulty resides, at least according to my hypothesis. But finally, having read all of those, then I start reading original Greek texts, just finding them on TLG or on Perseus. One of them I just fell in love with was Kalihroi, these novels from the Koine period, which are Atticizing for the most part. They're pretty similar to Attic, but why is, and then, oh, of course, I got one of these Hadavas. I'll do more reviews on the polýMATHY Plus channel to talk about these if you're interested. Love them. Again, the thing is great because when you don't know a word, you can look down here. But having done that Ranieri-Roberts method, which of these words do I not know? I know all of them. I know every single word on this page. And on this page too, it's very rare to find one. So I'm doing true extensive reading. I'm doing fluent reading, and I'm enjoying the heck out of the story. Whereas you can take the Symposium or the Republic, and you generally might even have a lot of the words, but it's not necessarily as entertaining. Still, you're able to get there. What's my point? I've started making 2 points simultaneously. So the first is that the only way to succeed at becoming a fluent reader of ancient Greek is to read as much as you possibly can and to somehow make it extensive. And in a moment here, I'm going to give you a kind of off the cuff, there, that's what will come out. So I'm going to off the cuff reading plan, even if you're not using all of these readers back here. And it's expensive to buy all these books if you're not a fanatic about this stuff like I am. If you just want to become a reader of ancient Greek, do you really have to buy 20 readers or 15 or however many that's on that list? I don't even remember. Do you need to buy all those? Gosh, you shouldn't have to. There really, ideally, should just be one book, kind of like Familia Romana, maybe a few supplements, that gets you most of the way. Ideally, that's what any one of these should be, but they're not. Again, see the Ranieri-Roberts Approach to Ancient Greek video to learn about that. Something that's also nice is that the more I read of normal ancient Greek literature, classical, Attic, Koine, even, hey look, lyric poets. These are great too. The more I read of this stuff, the easier it is to then pick up Homer, because every possible vocabulary word that is in common between Homeric and later Greek, at least you've seen it before, so it becomes that much easier to appreciate the epic. Otherwise, if you just want to pick up Homer, if you're doing a grammar and you're going right into Homer, ooh, that's going to be tough. Gosh, I'd say at least do Hesiod first, but that's just my opinion. Homer's way more, awesome, I think, for most people, right? Those are the epics, so they want to go into them if they're all about Homer. And I get it. I was profoundly inspired by the Iliad, just by doing the Iliad 100 audiobook and by doing the Kephalos challenge. So, the most important thing I think I should tell you is that it's not you.
You're giving me the it's not you, it's me routine?
It's not your fault if it takes you longer to learn ancient Greek than it took you to learn Latin, or feel like you reached some sort of comfortable point. It's certainly true for me and most of my colleagues. The language is filled with a number of small obstacles, all of which are superable, especially through reading as much as you can until you make it extensive, until you could pick up, one of these, an Ephesian tale, pick up one of these novels and just follow, and you just understand it. And maybe, you get some glosses if you need them, but just read right along. And that's another thing to talk about too, how to read, especially if you read, like with Kalichroe. I just got this recently, but I've been reading the digital text I found on Perseus. So like with that, how was I reading it? I would get a paragraph. I didn't have any calcs or anything. If I wanted to know a word, I'd have to look it up in the dictionary. But because the story was so immediately compelling, I didn't want to. I wanted to keep reading and see what happened. And if I didn't understand a word, if it did seem to interfere too much, I would keep going. That was super useful and very, very helpful. So this, for example, if I were seeing this for the first time, I would read this whole page, this whole paragraph, not look at any of the glosses. Try to read through it. Try to just kind of see, and especially if I've been reading, see if I'm still getting the context. I mean, this is an out of context thing, so maybe this isn't a perfect example. But let's say this is the beginning of a chapter, and I don't necessarily know what's going on yet, so I need to figure that out. I'll try to read and follow and hopefully understand a lot. That's the first reading. Do it kind of fast, sometimes very fast. You want to try to get yourself to be a faster reader. I'll have to make a separate video about that topic, because that's really interesting and useful and something I'm still working on, trying to bring my ancient Greek reading speed up to my Latin reading speed, for example. Second time, read through it. Anytime you still don't recognize a word, now that you have the context, you may have figured out maybe you didn't recognize diasosden, because it starts with that prefix. Remember the prefix thing? But then you see later, oh no, it's sozi, and dia means through. Okay, I got it. It's, saving through, saving completely, something like that. So you don't need to look at the gloss. If you think you got it, just keep reading. Just keep reading. Do not look down at the gloss yet. Do not try to translate it. Whatever you do, resist.
Resistance is futile.
Resistance is not futile. You can do it and go through again, and then you might understand it better. Think of it as rewinding a really good scene you just saw. Rereading is not a bad thing. It's vital. Yeah, you don't do it in your native language when you read a novel. That's fine. Good for you. Sometimes you do want to if you really enjoy that experience. Most of the time, maybe you won't do it. Do it here. We want to make things as extensive as possible. Third time through, if you still don't understand, I don't know, hormesai. Let's see if hormesai is glossed down here. And we see hormao, set in motion. Begin. Okay, and then I get the sentence, kre ton stolon hormesai, right? Something like that might be your experience. But you didn't look at every gloss. Avoid it if you can. You don't really need to do that. If you're just someone who you feel like you need to see every word on the page, wait. You're trying to read the original story. You're trying to use these tools as little as you possibly need to maintain the reading experience. Then when you get to the end of the chapter, we'll reread it for one. After you finish a section, go back and reread it. After you finish a chapter, reread the whole chapter. If the story is not so compelling that it's pushing you ahead. If it is, do what you want. Keep reading. It's fantastic. You're doing great. But if you are able to go and reread the same chapter, whatever new words, you'll learn them better. You will form new neural connections all associated with Ancient Greek that will make everything easier. That is the whole point. Just like with the readers, right? Reread those readers. Reread any of them if you can. This also goes for these passages, and especially not necessarily very clear readers like this one, where you get to some paragraph or chapter, you're like, what on earth did I just read? I only got Italian glosses, or maybe nothing. That's also a nice thing about the Ranieri-Roberts approach is if you feel that way about any of the readings in any of the books, don't struggle, move on, read another book in that column, then go back to it. Do something else, then come back to it with fresh eyes and perhaps armed with grammar, vocabulary, explanations, context of the words in a way that when you get back to the unnecessarily challenging thing, then you'll understand it more clearly. Also, in your reading, include at least once reading aloud. Maybe that's the first time, maybe it's the second time, the third time. There's all kinds of different ways you could do it, but you want to read aloud to try to incorporate more of the senses of the language. Language is fundamentally speech. And then another thing that is so good to do, you read a paragraph. And then you act as the teacher and you ask yourself what you just read. If you were a teacher and you were teaching this paragraph, what would you teach? Let's say you just read this. If you were the teacher, how would you challenge the student to see if there's any understanding? And doing it only in Ancient Greek. Okay. Metapempetai de ton ai polon. Tina metapempetai. Diati. Poi. Right? Where? Why? Whom? Ask these questions of yourself and say them aloud. If you don't need to look at the text, you can just look away and say it aloud. You're really engaging with the language. You really make it your own. Or if you have to go read and find the answer to your question that you posed, so much the better. That's a part of critical reading that we should do when reading the literature, especially more difficult literature in our own languages, being critical. Why is this happening? Why is this character doing this? We should also do it with cinema, by the way. That's another story. Talking to yourself in Latin or Ancient Greek are such effective ways to build up excellent ability, of course, at speaking, but also at reading, because the language has more sense for you. It has meaning for you that resonates in your psyche. Okay, so what about a reading plan? Now, I mentioned the Ranieri-Roberts approach too many times. Great way, but you could also just use a Tentative. You could use one of these and try to get through it all. Let's say you do that, because if you use the Ranieri-Roberts approach, you're basically prepared to look at any original literature either with, there we go, a little bit Euripides, Medea, that's pretty cool. Unrelated, but awesome. So you might have one of these which again has the glosses. Use them only when you need them, like we talked about. You could probably go to the original play, and whether there's struggling involved or not, you get through it. You read. If you really want to read this, you'll be able to read it. Aristophanes is easier and a lot more fun, but about to get to that in a second. And that's if you read all those books in the Ranieri-Roberts approach, and if you felt like it was leading to a good progression, if your eyes are going over the text and you're not absorbing anything in any of the books in a certain column, well then come back when you're fresh. If it's just, the Athenians chapter, just like, what happened? Don't worry about it. If it's the Logos chapter, don't worry about it. Just get into something. Maybe the Reading Greek has something that's nice, or the Ancient Greek Alive, or the Rouse. One of them might have something that's lovely and interesting that keeps your interest and gives you that dopamine hit. So you're effectively prepared to deal with any literature. But even if you do all that, or if you don't do all of the books in that approach, what do? What if you just have an elementary grammar and you want to just start reading original stuff? Because you can. Because it is possible to do that. This is what I think you should do. And I'm going to have to really think about this in better detail, because so much of my experiences with these readers, either using them for myself or teaching with them over the years, that it's hard to imagine what actually literally most people do when they try to become readers of Ancient Greek, which is to go through the grammar translation. And they might just only have a typical grammar textbook to take them all the way through. And then it's like, whoo, into the deep end. Go enjoy your Plato or Homer. I don't think you should go that way. You need to become a reader of it, right? You need to become fluent at reading something. And that thing, whether you like it or not, is almost certainly going to be one of the Gospels. John, Luke, for example, or maybe something else in the New Testament. Possibly also the Septuagint. A little bit more dicey there, but that could work too. You want to be able to read something that you can understand. Now, if you're a biblical scholar, aspiring perhaps, or if you're a priest, or if your religion is really important to you and you want to explore that part, well, you're going to love the New Testament. You already do. You get to enjoy it in the original. Fantastic. But there are plenty of other people who are mostly interested in classical literature or even pagan Koine literature. They're not necessarily interested in the Christian literature that's in Ancient Greek. That's perfectly fine. My advice to those people is, nevertheless, it is the easiest thing to read in Ancient Greek. That's original and real. That's a dopamine hit. When I read the Gospel of John for the first time, that was a significant dopamine hit. Every little chapter, every little verse, like, I understood that, I understood that, I understood that. Sometimes I would usually use the Latin Vulgate to help me get through it, because I just was, I didn't want to read every single one of the readers or grammar books yet. I did that later. I wanted to read real Greek, and it was real, and it was exciting, and it pulled me through. Something that's great about the Gospels is they are stories. Any kind of story, if you can identify with the characters, the situations, something in it, it will pull you through, and you will want to keep reading. That cannot be underestimated. Otherwise, our affective filter is raised, and we're just going to block out exactly the thing that we're trying to learn. Now, I get it. If that affective filter is raised for a type of literature that you're just not interested in, I know. But let's assume you want to sample all of Ancient Greek literature. I think the path you should take is to read a gospel. Read the Gospel of John. I have the audiobook on my audiobook store if you want to use that. Or you just go to Bible Gateway and read the original, have parallel text. And that's another thing too. Having parallel texts, like my Xenophon, where's my Xenophon? Or this is great, these Lyrici Greci. Fantastic, because if ever I'm in doubt, especially because this dialect, if it's Aeolic or something, might be different than what I'm used to seeing in Attic and Koine. And then I just have to look over there like, oh, okay, I found the word I needed to know, thanks to the Italian. And because it's not in English, I feel slightly less like I'm cheating. And it's not cheating. It's really not. We're denafango. It's not cheating because You're trying to make it comprehensible. Is it cheating when in Familia Romana, here's my old 2005 copy, is it cheating that there's a picture that's telling you what an ois is and what the sol is, or an arbor, or all of that? No, that's not cheating. It is the same principle here, either with glosses and also with a side-by-side translation, like in my Xenophon. Boy, there's some great stories in this, by the way. I'll talk about this another day. Great stuff. Whatever reading level you're at, the point is that you want to be able to eventually read any of these anecdotes only in the Greek. You have the teaching language to help you figure out any individual word or words or phrases or the sense, but eventually you want to totally absorb the Greek one so you can finally read at least once the original Greek without having to look over at your translated language over on the side, Italian in the case of this text. Also true of those calcs. Don't be satisfied reading something like this, cool and beautiful though it is, if your only time reading a chapter or a page or the whole book is by having read through it just once and constantly going down and getting to the calcs. Think of it kind of like as a game. I lost a point because I had to look up agora. Oh gosh, I hope not. But you know, it depends what level you're at. You could be a total beginner and try to use this and stroll your way through. That would be interesting. Not having much grammar, and if maybe not at all, you just can read the alphabet and going through. That would be very interesting if someone does that. That'd be pretty cool. I wonder if that's possible. It is, actually. That's pretty exciting. And that's an important thing about getting too involved with the grammar or the morphology. Purely drilling grammar and morphology out of context is not going to yield the results that you would hope. So much better is, even if you're like most people, you have seen most or all of the grammatical forms, but you know, you might still get tripped up by the, I don't know, aorist, participle, and passive. The idea is if you read it in the context of the story, you might be able to just go past it. Your brain fills it in. You reread it and they're like, oh, right, of course, that's the aorist participle. I remember what that is. I know what it means. Taste, right, having put doesn't mean gods or anything. You're able to resolve those little problems in your head. That's exactly what we did when we were kids, learning to read our native languages fluently. So, not cheating to use a side-by-side translation, but you do lose points until you read that verse, that chapter, or the whole book of whatever it is. In this case, I'm talking about the book of John, without having to look at a translation or to look up a word you don't know. That's how you win. That's how you win that game. Okay, let's say you do a gospel. You read the Gospel of John, and you learned a lot from doing that. Then what do? Next, go to these tremendously entertaining novels that are filled with adventure and love and all kinds of things that will keep you engaged, that will keep you entertained. All right, I was talking about how Familia Romana, I think, I enjoyed this story. Not everybody does. Carla Hurt, whom I mentioned, for example, we had an interview years ago, she doesn't like the story. She doesn't like the story. Doesn't matter how good the pedagogical method is. She's going to have her effective filter up. And that goes for anyone. If you love the story in Athenese, that's going to be a great book. If you don't, if you love all the cute little stories in Ancient Greek Alive, you're going to be in good shape. If you find some of them kind of tedious, like who is this Nasruddin character? Why are there these turtles talking? You know, you might be like, well, you don't really care about that. You want, where do I get to the Platonic philosophy? All right, well, their effective filter's going up. Don't struggle through it so much because you're just going to make it worse for yourself. But generally, these please pretty much everyone. Is Familia Romana actually a good novella? No. Is French in Action a good story? No. But the way it's told is sufficiently entertaining. Think of, I don't know, maybe what's a good example of things that people enjoy but aren't necessarily good writing. Is the soap operas count? I don't know. I barely watched any of those telenovelas. They keep you engaged, and these have a similar effect. Don't worry, they're not like soap operas if that's not your thing, and if they are like that. They, they're entertaining. They're fun. You like the characters. You feel bad for them when it doesn't go the way they were hoping. That's fantastic. That's reading. And you're enjoying it. Great. So you got those. You're going to get a lot out of that. Then where should you go? You could do a lot then, because now you're into Koine. At that point, I would say go to Lucian. Do at least one dialogue by Lucian. I love the Judgment of the Goddesses, Theon Chrysis. That's one I did the audiobook for. But all of them are fantastic. He covers so many different topics. He has science fiction and a true story. He has the Hetairai, the courtesans. All of those things that Lucian writes are pretty good and pretty entertaining and worth reading. So start with the Gospel. Then go to, say, one of these. Like Kali Hroi happens to be my favorite, but it's on the longer side. You might like an Ephesian tale better because it's shorter. It's also a little bit more high energy. Then go on to Lucian. Lucian's will be slightly harder. And Lucian is an Atticist. So it's pretty much like Attic. At that point, you can go many directions. So you go to big, obvious historical types like Plutarch or Cassius Dio or Polybius. Those are all great. I love them. If you really want to read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, go for it. You can now. But I think after you've read one thing by Lucian, at least, if not several, go to Plato. And where did Republic Book 1 go? You should see the pile of books I've made over here. It's a mess. It's going to take forever. The things I do for you. Just messing up all my books, all my order of the books. Okay. Whether you find just, some... find this on Perseus or TLG, Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, or if you get this edition or any edition you have, bilingual, that could be good, a lobed version, if you like that, whatever. This Republic Book 1 might be on the more entertaining side. Don't try to read the whole Republic at one time, unless this is what you were dying to do. Shortest one, I think technically is Critias, but Ion is complete. Critias ends abruptly. Some people like the Symposium or the Apology. There's a bunch of options, and you don't even necessarily have to read the whole thing. I am very much into using the language actively, so I like going through Plato and finding the shortest lines possible. Egoge. That's cool. Just means I myself. Why is he saying that? Because Socrates was asked a question, and saying egoge like that is saying, yes, I do, or I am, or whatever. Anyway, it's nice to kind of see really short sentences that have that kind of conversational utility. Banyuge, egoge, banyumenmun. Lovely stuff. Potentially very useful for talking to yourself when you're trying to teach yourself. Ask yourself questions about the paragraph or the page or chapter that you just read. So once you've read one dialogue by Plato, you're probably ready for something by Xenophon. Everybody swears by the Anabasis. I haven't fallen in love with it yet. I just haven't read enough of it. I do like this, though. I really like seeing Socrates in Plato's depiction of him, and also seeing Socrates in Xenophon's depiction, because they have pretty different purposes, I would say. It's probably good to see Socrates in the Platonic dialogue, because that is the Socrates, Hosokrates. That's him. That's the guy. But in Xenophon, it's almost like you see the real Socrates a little bit. And he's still Socrates. He talks like Socrates, like Plato writes him too. They're anecdotes in the Memorabilia. Xenophon's not necessarily trying there to produce a work of advanced philosophy. So I find that really enjoyable. I might even say before that, but let's say you read some of them of Xenophon, whatever it is. If you like it, you're fine. But the next thing to go to is Aristophanes. You want to get something by Aristophanes. Here's the frogs, the rane. I love Aristophanes. This is kind of a new thing for me because I just wasn't getting around to reading Aristophanes. I've been reading Plato for, a while and getting through that. And then I found this is so much easier, even though in some ways it's harder. How can that be? This is the experience I had when I read the Amphitrio for the first time. These are comic playwrights. It's like reading one of the comedies by Shakespeare. You can follow along easily. A lot of the sentences are short. Remember how I was pointing out those short sentences to you in Plato? Badis de deuro, kaireo despota. Yo! This is great. It's all right here on the page and filled with hilarious vulgarities. If you don't mind that, if you enjoy a decent joke, he won with these plays, with most of them that are preserved. So at least somebody appreciated the humor at some point. You might too. And if it has that effect on you, then you're going to want to keep reading. My advice with this is you could probably start reading Aristophanes anytime, but say if you follow this progression that I know I'm just coming up with. I should have thought this out better. I will make a future video, especially if you bug me about it, where I go into more detail and better detail. But probably what you should do, is, especially if you have the bilingual version, you can follow everything. Don't get too bogged down by, say, the choroi, the choruses, if they're filled with too many words that you don't understand, or if it's not really funny. I mean, the first chorus here with the singing frogs, I don't know, I think it's pretty funny, because Dionysus singing along keeps saying how, like, oh, I hate this song, why can't I just shut up? You know, it's great. So some of them are pretty good. But otherwise, if you get to stuff that's difficult, just maybe glance over at the the translated language and get to some part that's more interesting or funny, and then read that in the Greek and enjoy it in the Greek. So you get exposed to this and you realize that Aristophanes isn't that bad or hard. It's actually maybe one of the easiest things, because it could be one of the most enjoyable things. After that, you could probably go to anything. It depends where your interests lie. You go on to the tragedies, you could go on to Homer, and go forward back into the Koine literature, medieval literature. You're well armed at that point, and then you will have learned ancient Greek. You will be able to access thousands of years of literature. And if you have Latin too, then you'll be unstoppable. It's amazing and so worth it. I don't know if I could summarize all the stream of consciousness stuff I said today, but I think the most important thing is it's not you. It's not even necessarily Greek that's the problem. It's the fact that if we have a basis of comparison with, say, Latin, we get so disappointed with ourselves if we don't make similar progress, even if it's maybe slow by 2, even 3 times, trying to approach a similar competency level with ancient Greek as with Latin. That would be great. That's way faster than it is for most people, faster than it has been for me. Don't feel bad about that. Don't be hard on yourself. It's going to take time and patience. It's just going to take more effort than Latin. It's not a hard effort necessarily. It's a patience effort. And what's the solution? Read, 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 read. We unfortunately cannot immerse ourselves frequently, if ever, in only ancient Greek speaking environment for more than a week, if we're that lucky. So the only other way to get input is, well, actually, thankfully, the thing we want to do, to read the original. Read as much as you can. Use the readers. Use any of them that you like. If you really hate them, don't use it. If you just are not into a piece of literature that I might have even said that, oh, you should probably read this because it's on this track. No. Go to something that you like. Ancient Greek is so diverse in its literature. You're not going to have trouble finding something you like. Whether or not it's comprehensible at first, like Homer, for example, there's no prose version of Homer's dialect. That's an oxymoron. It's not a possibility. Yeah, I guess you could read Herodotus before going to Hesiod and then go to Homer. Yeah, if you want to go on a Homeric track, okay, read some things of Attic like I talked about. Then read Herodotus, because he's classical Greek, but it's in Ionic. Then go to Hesiod, and then go to Homer. That's the way to get into Homer if that's the direction you want to go. But if you're like, Herodotus is just clearly a kook, I don't need to read these fake news stories. I want to go to the myths of Hesiod, where they're more interesting, or whatever. Or I want to go out to Achilles and Hector. I want to go to the legends and the epics. And want to do that. You can do that. You can struggle through. But if you are interested in acquiring a good diversity of the ancient Greek literature, try something from the New Testament. Then try one of the novels like Kaliroe, or an Ephesian tale, Daphnis and Chloe. Then go to Lucian, at least a dialogue. Then go to a Platonic dialogue, maybe a bit of Xenophon, and then read Aristophanes. I guarantee when you get to Aristophanes, if you have a sense of humor, it's okay, I'm just kidding. If you enjoy his sense of humor, You're going to be so thrilled, and you will have made it. Thanks so much for joining me today as we discuss these issues. What about you? Have you been trying to learn Ancient Greek? Have you been struggling? Have you achieved an advanced level that you are comfortable with? How did you get there? We can all benefit by sharing our experiences, helping each other learn this incredibly important language, one with one of the richest and most diverse literatures of any in history. Thanks so much for watching and sharing this video. Thanks again to the Ancient Language Institute for supporting it. And thank you, as always, so much to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Karin Humine ko. Eroste.